Ethiopia and the Ark of the Covenant. But you may wonder why I'm showing you a map of Japan. The reason is I thought that I would just spend 10 minutes showing those who haven't seen them the underwater ruins of Japan, where Santa and I put in more than 200 dives. And I just want to preface that with this rather curious map from 1424, which shows Japan. This is a theme I didn't go into in my talk the other night because there wasn't time to cover all the ground, but there are many ancient maps which are copied from older source maps which appear to show the world as it looked during the last ice age. And this 1424 Pisagano chart, which belongs to the Portoland tradition of map making, shows the three main islands of Japan, which are Honshu, Kyushu and Shikoku, shows the three main islands of Japan as one island. And actually, that was the case during the Ice Age and down to about 12,000 years ago. And this is how Japan looked, the main islands of Japan looked during the Ice Age, with a deep, one single landmass, not three islands as they are today, and with a deep inlet here, exactly as we see on this 1424 map, and a bay here, exactly as we see on this 1424 map. There's a case for saying that this 1424 map of Japan is showing Japan as it looked during the last ice age, and like many other mysterious maps from that period, is copied from older source maps, now lost. And I want to, that is a preface to taking a look at the underwater monuments of Yonaguni, which are Yonaguni is the most southwestern of all the Japanese islands. It lies within sight on a clear day of Taiwan. And Santa and I were first introduced to the possibility that there were structures underwater there back in 1996. 1996, 1997, we learned to dive in order to go diving there, and then subsequently we put in at least 200 dives in and around Yonaguni, which I think qualifies us as the most immersed and most experienced Western divers who dived in Japan. There are one or two Japanese divers, notably Professor Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus, who have dived on that structure more than we have. He and his students have done hundreds and hundreds of dives, but Kimura and I both agree that what we're looking at is a gigantic man-made underwater complex, where I have to disagree with my good friend Robert Schock, the professor of geology at Boston University, who I took to Yonaguni in 1997. Schock was not capable of diving at that point, and he had to be held underwater by two Japanese divers. He found himself in a terrifying situation in the current, very severe current which flows past the monuments, rather stronger than a river in its force. I felt that his judgment that all of these structures were totally natural and had nothing to do with human workmanship at all was hasty. I felt it merited more work on his part than simply two dives of an incompetent diver who's mainly fighting for his life rather than studying the monuments. And that raises questions in my mind over Schock's judgment on the Bosnian pyramids as well, which he has also dismissed as natural. But I will make up my own mind on the Bosnian pyramids when I visit them in July this year, and until then I'm going to withhold judgment. These two gigantic pillars lie side by side against a huge rocky outcrop. I don't doubt that the rocky outcrop is natural, but I believe these two pillars have been put into place by human workmanship. The geological view is that they somehow fell neatly into place without breaking from some cliff above, and the fact that there is no cliff immediately above that point doesn't disturb those geologists. This is how the pillars look against the rocky outcrop in context. And if we now swim around here, we come to the terraces of Yonaguni. which are certainly the most striking feature of the monument, with these very clear rock-cut terraces in the side of the monument. And the argument that they are natural is based on the following assumption, namely that this is a sedimentary rock, and that as it was laid down over the course of geological time, softer and harder layers were laid in place. And then as sea level rose, beating against the rock, it selectively removed the softer layers and left the harder layers in place, giving this stepped formation. And it's not a totally ridiculous argument, but once you get to know the monument well, as we have done, and I think it's a monument that deserves hundreds of dives rather than 2 dives, once you get to know it well, you realize that there's problems with that explanation. Because where you would expect to see all of that rubble that was removed from here, supposedly by the sea, in order to create this stepped effect, well, you'd expect to see it down below those terraces down here, but what you see instead is a perfectly clear straight pathway. And on that pathway, all the rubble has been cleared to one side, leaving the pathway intact, and there are indeed gutters running along the side of the pathway. So to me, that speaks of human workmanship rather than the work of nature. And then we have this extraordinary face underwater further up the coast, about half a mile further up the coast, where you have 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth looking due south. And I'm in there for scale. It's a gigantic structure. There are in fact pupils in the eyes. And if you look here, you can see that there are the remnants of a headdress on the side of this underwater face. And if nature did make it, it was quite amazing that nature separated off the head from the rest of the rocky outcrop in order to make it. And as we pull back, we can see the whole thing in context and see that there's a huge flat patio in front of it, and again along this pathway there are gutters on either side. Now I want to take you further north now to Okinawa and what are called the Kerama group of islands, and specifically Akajima, 40 kilometers west of Okinawa, where we found these structures underwater. They were actually found by a local Japanese diver, and he drew our attention to them. And there's 2 distinct aspects. There are small, what turn out to be river stones, which appear to be cemented to the seabed in semicircular formations. And then there is a huge rock-cut series of stone circles, which are actually, they're not built, they're carved down into the bedrock on a very substantial scale. And that gives you the scale. That's me holding the video camera there. And of course all of these photographs are taken by Santa, I need to emphasize. I don't give enough credit to my amazing wife, who risks her life. Because, diving and photographing on these structures requires a whole mixture of different skills, and sometimes the dives are incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Can I just ask you to mention the Kerala?
Yeah.
Where the German geologists did off-camera say that it's man-made.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're looking at here is a central upright with a series of surrounding megaliths, all of which are carved out of the solid bedrock at the bottom of the sea. And you can see that the outer megaliths form a kind of spiral around the central upright. And the way that the outer curve of the central upright matches the inner curve of the surrounding uprights is particularly impressive to me. I don't think that there's any way that this could be made by nature. I took another geologist there, a German geologist called Wolf Wichmann, who often writes for Der Spiegel magazine. And he admitted on camera that he couldn't, because we were filming, he admitted on camera that he couldn't think of any natural process that would have made this. And I then said to him on camera, well, what does that leave us with? And he said, well, I don't know. But off camera, he did confess that the only agent that could have made this would have been human beings. And since this stone circle is 110 feet beneath the sea, and since we have the geology of the site very well established, we know that it has been submerged for more than 12,000 years. So by definition, we are looking at the work of a lost civilization off the coast of Japan. So that's just a quick run through. There's many more structures underwater in Japan, which I've not really got time to show you tonight, but I just thought it would be interesting to take a quick look at those. Now we will jump to the Ark of the Covenant, and a completely different story, and Ethiopia. And again, all of the photographs that I'll show you here tonight are Santa's work, apart from two aerials of the rock-hewn site of Lalibela in Ethiopia. Everything else is Santa's photography. So the Ark of the Covenant, this incredibly mysterious, powerful, energized biblical relic. It is actually it dominates the biblical story from the time of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt until the building of the Temple of Solomon. There's more than 200 separate references to it in the Bible. And we understand that it had these two winged figures which were perched on top of a lid that was called the mercy seat. And the two winged figures are described as cherubim, and their wings joined together above the ark. And it's often spoken of a cloud and a light and a fire that rises up between these two figures. It's impossible to read the very detailed biblical and extra-biblical accounts of the Ark of the Covenant without, at some point or another, thinking technology. It does sound like a technological artifact. And when I say that, I don't mean to remove its sacred quality, because it's certainly that as well. And indeed, the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, in which it's described as a radio for talking to God, is not far off the mark, because Moses did talk to God through the Ark of the Covenant. And it's Moses we're looking at here, and Moses is about to be, I believe, no, not Moses, it's Noah, who's going to be the subject of a film soon, starring Russell Crowe. But this is the typical view of Moses on Mount Sinai, the fire up above and holding the tablets of the Ten Commandments. And this is Mount Sinai. At the foot is a monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery. It's a very wild area, amazing area amazing mountain to climb. There are some steps cut into it at certain points, and various quotations from the Bible that one finds scattered here and there. But Mount Sinai is not the only contender. The place that we now call Mount Sinai is not the only contender for the Sinai of the Bible. The other one is this one, which is called Sirabit al-Kadem. And Sirabit al-Kadem is in southern Sinai, and on the west side of the Sinai. And on top of it is an Egyptian temple dedicated to Hathor. And it's clear that the Egyptians were there, and indeed were all over the Sinai. And here they mined turquoise. There's a strong scholarly case that has been made that Mount Sinai has been misidentified as the Mount Sinai of the Bible, and Sirabit al-Kadem is actually the place. So there's the Ark of the Covenant. And it's clear to anybody who has studied the Ark and also studied ancient Egyptian traditions that there are commonalities. For example, at Karnak, the Temple of Karnak in Luxor in Upper Egypt, you can see many depictions of priests carrying what looks like a sort of boat on their shoulders, on carrying poles. And in the center of the boat is a shrine, a box-like shrine, and they walk in procession carrying the ark. And in fact, you can see an Ark of the Gods in the Temple of Horus in Edfu in Upper Egypt. one has survived, and you can see it. I mean, it's been repaired, but you can see it's carrying poles, and there's the boat, and there's the shrine. So this is an object which bears an image of the god, which is carried on the shoulders of priests in procession. And there's no doubt in my mind, and indeed in the minds of many scholars, that we have a precursor of, or an archetype of the Ark of the Covenant in these arks of the gods from ancient Egypt. And you will also see other arks in the relics brought out of the tomb of Tutankhamun, again carried on carrying poles, and in this case very box-like in form, with an interesting sort of triangular lid on the top. So ancient Egypt is full of arks. Another thing, you'll see this is the figure of Isis from the tomb of Seti I in the West Bank of Luxor. But and here are Isis and Nephthys with their winged figures, with their wings meeting together. Very similar concept, similar concept to the cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So what I'm building up to say here is that clearly there is an ancient Egyptian connection and an ancient Egyptian background to the Ark of the Covenant, and various aspects of the story of the Ark are really quite intriguing. I did a massive amount of the work on this, not only in the Bible itself, which is full of spooky references, but also in the legends of the Jews and huge numbers of extra biblical sources that speak of the Ark of the Covenant. And just a quick summary of some of the things that the Ark does. It stops the waters of the River Jordan when the Israelites cross into Jordan. It's rather like a repeat of the Red Sea scene. The waters of the Jordan pile up on either side, and the priests walk through carrying the Ark. It's a fearsome weapon in battle. It's used again and again in battle, and there are accounts of the Ark flying forward, rushing forward towards the enemies of Israel, emitting a moaning or a howling sound, and sparks of fire shooting out of it. It kills the unfortunate Uzzah when it's being carried up towards Jerusalem. It's being carried on a cart, and he reaches out to steady it, and a bolt of fire shoots out of it and kills him on the spot. It sometimes killed its own bearers when they didn't handle it properly. There was a very detailed series of rituals and preparations that had to be obeyed in order to carry the Ark of the Covenant. It's implicated in the destruction of Jericho. We tend to focus on the blowing of the horns, but it's the Ark that's carried 7 times around the walls of Jericho, and the walls of Jericho come down. It's difficult to resist a feeling that we're dealing with some sort of out-of-place technology here. And last but not least, the killing of 50,000 Philistines at Ashdod, when the Ark is captured in battle, briefly, by the Philistines. They take it off to the city of Ashdod on the coast, and they make the horrendous mistake of opening the Ark of the Covenant, and then they place it on a table, and the population of Ashdod, it becomes a sort of tourist trophy, and the population of Ashdod file past it. And then we read in the Bible how they all die very soon afterwards, and there's a specific statement that they die of cancerous tumors. So all of this, you can't read this without wondering what on earth is going on with this extraordinary object. And there again, let's go back to Egypt, those arks of the gods that the priests carry in procession. They are fiery and dangerous objects, and so are the crowns of the pharaohs, which are said to radiate heat, and if not worn with proper protection beneath them, will burn themselves into the head of the wearer. As far as I'm aware, no ancient Egyptian crown has ever been found. Only images of the crowns and accounts of the power of the crowns. We see stone sculptures of the crowns and reliefs of the crowns, but not them. We do not find the crowns themselves. There's this. You'll see this on every Ancient Aliens show. It's down in a crypt. It's down in a crypt beneath the Temple of Dendera. You have to bribe the guards and go down there, and there's a whole network of corridors and passageways underneath the temple. Very dark. There's some low wattage lighting down there now, and we see this
most peculiar scene with this serpent seeming to energize something. And this is also, I mean, we're bound to construe this in modern terms, also kind of like a spark plug or something like that. In fact, it's the jet pillar of Osiris. What is going on here, and why is it in this dark, dark place? Are we looking at some sort of instrument for generating light? Is that what's being depicted here? Again, I'm just making the point that there are echoes of a lost technology in the ancient Egyptian traditions, like, for example, this so-called bird. It's filed amongst birds in the Cairo Museum. It's in a display case full of birds, but it isn't a bird. It's got a vertical upright tail, and it's got wings with an aerofoil section. And in fact, it has been wind tunnel tested and proves to be an extremely effective aeroplane, which came out of a tomb near the temple of Saqqara, the pyramid of Saqqara in Upper Egypt. So either this is just a total accident that the principles of the aerofoil section are found in an object from ancient Egypt, or we're looking at the traces of some sort of lost technology in ancient Egypt. I talked at length the other day about the pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Giza, how the Great Pyramid models the dimensions of the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200, how it is very precisely within 3/60ths of a single degree aligned to true north. I think it goes without saying that the makers of the Great Pyramid, whoever they were the masters of a science that we don't fully understand today. Egyptology dismisses the mystery of the Great Pyramid too easily. It's truly an extraordinary monument. I do believe it's the work of human beings, but I think that it incorporates technological principles that are way ahead of the time that is attributed to it, including that knowledge of the dimensions of the Earth. So again, staring us in the face, overlooking Giza, is this proof that the builders of the pyramids knew a thing or two that we would call science today. And of course, Moses is a figure whose story begins in Egypt. Moses is indeed reared in the household of the Pharaoh. He is groomed to be a future Pharaoh of Egypt. Outraged at the treatment of the Israelites and rejects that destiny and rebels against the Israelites. And we read the story of Moses and Aaron performing a series of magic tricks. And there's a way where magic and science intersect to overawe and strike fear into the heart of the Pharaoh. And finally, we know the story. Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, across the Red Sea. The waters of the Red Sea part, and the Sinai episode occurs. And it's at Sinai, wherever Sinai is, whether it's Sarabat al-Qadim or Mount Sinai, that Moses is given the blueprint for the Ark of the Covenant. And it is a blueprint. It's in the book of Exodus. It's extremely clear. We can get the dimensions of the Ark. It's 3 feet 9 inches long. It's 2 feet 3 inches high and wide. It's all done in cubits. It's a series of boxes. The inner box is gold. Then there's a wooden box around that. Then there's a golden box around that. So it's an internested series of gold, wood, gold. And I have to mention in passing that gold is an incredibly effective radiation shield. And it then plays this huge role in the story of the Israelites. It's carried in procession as the Israelites make their journey through the Sinai and eventually enter into the Promised Land. And as I mentioned, it's used as a weapon of battle, and it plays a huge role in the story of the conquest of Israel. And there is this moment when the Philistines steal the ark, as I mentioned, and the terrible devastation that the ark inflicts upon the people of Ashdod. Again, sounds like technology to me. Then when the ark is returned, it's returned on a cart. The Philistines just can't, they just want it gone, and they stick it on the back of a cart drawn by oxen, and they just send it off towards the Israelites, because they're so terrified of what it's done to them. Understandably, it killed 50,000 people. It's the cart is seen by the Israelites, and the ark is then possessed by David, King David. He's the one who wants to bring it up to Jerusalem, and it's his aspiration to build a temple. And it's on that journey up to Jerusalem that Uzzah is struck dead by a bolt of fire from the ark. He didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't an evil man. He just tried to steady it. So it's like there's an uncontrolled technology at work here. It needs to be carried by the Levites who know what they're doing. It shouldn't just be on the back of a cart. And David dances before the ark. We read a detailed account in the Bible of the way that David dances before the ark, of the musical instruments that are played. But here's the thing. David is not going to be allowed to build the temple for the Ark of the Covenant, because David has done some wicked things. He's not pure. He's got many crimes to answer for. And God tells him that he will not build the temple, that it will be Solomon, his son, who builds the temple. And it's important to recognize that there is only one reason given in the Bible for the construction of the temple, and that is to serve as an house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. The whole edifice is built as a place for the Ark of the Covenant to be. There's been 200 separate references to the Ark prior to this time, and it's Solomon who gets to build the temple that will contain the Ark. Solomon, who is renowned actually for his magical powers and for his wisdom. And there's another element of the Solomon story which concerns the Queen of Sheba, which is told at length in the Bible. And there's a hint of romance, even in the biblical account, of some sort of romantic liaison between Solomon and Sheba, wherever Sheba comes from. And Solomon builds the temple, and this is a model of the temple, and the Holy of Holies is a cubical golden box to contain the gold box of the Ark of the Covenant. Again, I remind you, gold is an incredibly effective radiation shield, apparently more effective than lead. And the bronze sea, which is described as a part of the temple furniture, if you like, it's a huge, almost a lake-sized vessel of water that stands in the courtyard of the temple. And I just want to compare that notion of a sacred body of water with the temple, and indeed the appearance of the temple with its columns, with the temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt. Of course, these two columns, Jachin and Boaz, are of great significance to Freemasons today. And there's the temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt, and there's its sacred lake. Now, there's a mystery surrounding the construction of the temple, and this intersects a lot with Freemasonic concerns. It's the mystery of Hiram Abiff. And we read in 2 Chronicles 2:11-14 how King Hiram of Tyre wrote a letter to King Solomon advising him that he was sending Huram Abi to work on the temple. And this Hiram Abiff, as the Masons call him, Hiram Abi, was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali. It's confirmed in Scripture. The son of a widow is a very interesting motif, which is worth keeping in mind. I'll touch on it again in a moment. And King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre. He was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and cunning to work all works in brass. And he came to King Solomon and wrought all his works. That's in 1 Kings 7:13-14. Now, according to Masonic tradition, Hiram was murdered by 3 of his assistants soon after he completed the bronze work of the temple. And this event is commemorated in the initiation ceremonies for Master Masons, in which the initiate is required to play the role of the murder victim. And John J. Robinson, a Freemason, his excellent book is Born in Blood, which I highly recommend, about Masonic traditions, describes how, blindfolded on the ground, the initiate hears the three murderers decide to bury him in a pile of rubble until low 12, that's midnight, when they will carry the body away from the temple. To symbolize the burial of Hiram Abiff, the candidate is wrapped in a blanket and carried to the side of the room. Soon he hears a bell strike 12 times and is carried from the rubble grave to a grave dug on the brow of the hill west of Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. He hears the murderers agree to mark his grave with a sprig of acacia and then to set out to escape to Ethiopia across the Red Sea. A couple of resonances here. First of all, that sprig of acacia. The wood of the Ark of the Covenant itself is described as acacia wood. In the Masonic tradition, a sprig of acacia is involved in this story of Hiram Abiff, and Ethiopia figures in the story. There's actually, I mentioned the other day how the Acacia nilotica, the acacia tree of ancient Egypt, was the tree of life, and how it's rich in dimethyltryptamine. And there's just a new piece of research out which is arguing that there are a whole range of DMT-connected rituals in Freemasonry, all connected to this acacia theme that comes up again and again. So the Ark, Solomon builds the temple, and the Ark is now carried in great ceremony into the temple. And we read how a cloud fills the space of the Holy of Holies. And that's when the Ark disappears from view. After that, it's hardly mentioned in the Bible again. Hundreds of years pass with the Ark unremarked, and what I would definitely describe as the greatest mystery of the Bible is taking shape. Put a date on this: Solomon is putting the Ark into the temple round about, give or take a few years, round about 950 before Christ. Round about just under 3,000 years ago. And the next big event is the sacking of the temple by the Babylonians, which happens in 587 BC. In other words, about 400 years have passed with the Ark supposedly in the Holy of Holies, but no mention being made of it. And then we know, and this is a historical event, that Jerusalem is sacked by the Babylonians, the temple is destroyed, and its treasures are taken away to Babylon, along with the Israelites who are taken into captivity. But the Ark is conspicuously absent from the booty taken by the Babylonians. The Babylonians were fearsome bureaucrats, and they kept very detailed records, and those records have survived. And we have the records of what they took from the temple and what they returned to the temple after the captivity was over. And the Ark isn't mentioned. It's just not there. Scholars speculate that the Ark was, melted down, destroyed in some way, but since the Babylonians were careful to keep everything else, why would they not have kept the most important object of all? And why is it not mentioned at any point in this? This is why it's a mystery. This is why it's the lost Ark. Because this just doesn't make sense, this notion that it vanished during the Babylonian sack of Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of reasons to think that the Ark was gone before the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem. Like Jeremiah, who's mourning for the loss of the Ark about 40 years before the temple is sacked by the Babylonians. And it shall come to pass, when ye be multiplied and increased in the land, in those days, saith the Lord, they shall say no more, the Ark of the covenant of the Lord, neither shall it come to mind, neither shall they remember it, neither shall they visit it, neither shall that be done any more. And I just show you this map because Ethiopia is going to figure more and more in the story. And there's Israel, and there's Ethiopia, and yes, I confess they do seem incredibly far apart. And why should Ethiopia be connected to the story of the Ark of the Covenant? Well, the possibility that it was connected to the story of the Ark of the Covenant rather forced itself upon me during the very early 1980s. In fact, in 1982-83, I was the East African correspondent for The Economist. I was traveling regularly in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia was a war-torn, famine-stricken land at that time. And there is a certain number of very ancient historic cities in Ethiopia, which include Aksum up here in Tigray province, Gondar, Lalibela, Bahadar, and Lake Tana. And I found myself going to the city of Aksum in 1983. And at that time, Aksum was an armed camp, completely surrounded by the rebels of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. As a matter of fact, when I flew into Aksum, I did so on a DC-3 that was being used as, primarily being used to evacuate the wounded from the battlefields. And the back of that DC-3 was actually swimming in blood. And the pilots of the DC-3 were both Zambian mercenaries who got drunk with me the night before we flew into Aksum. And they explained to me why we would have a hair-raising descent into Aksum. They said, don't worry if we just dive straight down at the ground. That's because there's machine gun nests all around the town, and if we do a long, slow approach, we're going to get shot out of the sky. So I was somewhat prepared for this terrifying landing at Aksum. But when I got off the plane, Aksum was then still in government hands. I found myself in this magical kingdom with all these incredible rituals being performed. And here's a sacred lake. And here is a priest sending out a little lighted boat into the waters. These priests are Christians. Sacred lake at Karnak. There are obelisks at Aksum. They call them stele there. The biggest one is actually it's fallen now. It's 110 feet tall and weighs more than 500 tons. And these stele, they're not true obelisks like the ancient Egyptian obelisk, but they are very obelisk-like things, and they are carved out of solid granite and repeat the features of buildings. So a comparison there between Egypt and Ethiopia. And as I said, the place, an armed camp, it's been the focus of warfare in Ethiopia for a very long time. The Tigrayans are very serious people, and you meet people like this armed with AK-47s everywhere. And these amazing processions going on, and a box being carried out in procession. And actually, I was curious. I wanted to find out what was happening here. There I am as a younger man. Santa and I have been back and forward to Aksum many times over the year. The last time well, not the last time, but the most eventful journey we had to Aksum was in 1991, when Aksum had been seized by the rebels, and I was somewhat associated with the Ethiopian government. All my coverage had been done from the Ethiopian government side, but in order to get to Aksum, I had to go to the Tigray People's Liberation Front and say, please will you take me to Aksum? And they said, yeah, sure, if you're willing to risk your life. And so Santa and I did a deal with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and they told us to fly to Khartoum in Sudan, and there they met us. And then they drove us across the deserts of the Sudan to Kassala. They disguised Santa as an Ethiopian woman because she didn't have proper paperwork, but to get through the Sudanese authorities, they said to her, pretend that you're dumb and you can't speak, just wear the shawl. And then when we got to Kassala, we then crossed over into Eritrea, which was again a rebel province at that time. And it was an amazing journey where we had to do all our driving by night, because Ethiopian Air Force planes were strafing all of the roads to stop aid getting into the rebels during the day. And about half an hour before dawn, they would seek out a wooded area, and they would bring the vehicles into the shelter of the trees, and then they would go back and brush out the tracks for about a mile back before we went in there. And we would then spend the day under the trees and then drive again at night. It was an amazing journey to get back to Aksum again in 1991 and to review the mystery. It's clearly not the Ark of the Covenant, but what it is a symbol or a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, which is being carried out in procession in recognition of the fact, they say, that the original Ark of the Covenant is sitting there in the city of Aksum. And there is another one of those processions. There is the oldest church in Africa. That's the Church of St. Mary of Zion, which stands on top of an even older Christian structure going back to the 3rd century AD. And beside it is this little chapel, which was built by the Emperor Haile Selassie, whose original name was Ras Tafari, means Prince Tafari. Of course, the Rastafarians named themselves after him. Haile Selassie was claimed to be the 225th direct line descendant of Solomon and Sheba. I'll come to that in a moment. He built this chapel for the Ark of the Covenant, and in the 1960s it was taken out of the Church of St. Mary of Zion and carried into this chapel, and there it's remained ever since, supposedly. We understand that there's a huge system of tunnels underneath Axum where the Ark is taken in times of trouble, of which there have been many. Coming in closer, there's the chapel again. And here is one of the several guardians of the Ark, because once you're appointed as guardian of the Ark, you have a very short lifespan. We found about 3 years. Then the guardians die. We've got, in our series of visits to Axum over a period of several years, we met a number of different guardians whose predecessors had all died. We knew their predecessor, he died, a new guy had taken over. In one case, the guy who was appointed as guardian of the Ark, when appointed to be the guardian of the Ark, ran away. They had to send men after him into the hills and drag him back to the city, because once you're appointed as guardian of the Ark, you're never allowed to leave the grounds of the sanctuary chapel again. That's where you're going to spend the rest of your short life. And they have cataracts over their eyes. They all develop cataracts over their eyes. And this is what really hooked me to the story when I asked the first guardian I met about this, way back in 1983, why he said the Ark had caused his cataracts, and I said, why? And through the translator, he just sort of looked at me with that blind eye, and he said, the Ark is a thing of fire. I'd seen Raiders of the Lost Ark the year before, you know. How could I resist a story like that? It's an amazing story to follow up, and I did follow it up for years and years and years before I finally ended up writing a book about it. This is actually in the Ethiopian church in Jerusalem. There is an Ethiopian Coptic community in Jerusalem. They have a church right by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they have this painting of the Solomon and Sheba story. There is the Queen of Sheba visiting King Solomon. As far as the Ethiopians are concerned, the Queen of Sheba was an Ethiopian queen. Forget about Saba in the Yemen, which anyway was connected to Ethiopia culturally. She was an Ethiopian queen as far as they're concerned. And they're very frank about it. There was a romance between Solomon and Sheba. And that romance produced an offspring whose name was Menelik, which means the son of the wise man. He was the child of Solomon and Sheba. And Sheba left the court of Solomon pregnant. She returned to Ethiopia. She gave birth to Menelik there. And at the age of about 20, he returned to his father's court and was recognized as the son of Solomon. This is according to the Ethiopian national epic called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings. And he spent a year at his father's court, and then he contrived, as far as they're concerned, to steal the Ark of the Covenant. All sorts of skullduggery was engaged in, and he and his men stole the Ark of the Covenant from the Holy of Holies of the temple and fled with it. And Solomon sent troops after them, but he said to those troops, if my son has passed across the borders of Israel, that is a sign that God wants the Ark to go with him, and you are not to pursue him further. And it happened that Menelik and his group had crossed the border of Israel, and the pursuing troops fell back and didn't pursue them further, and the Ark was then taken to Ethiopia. That's how the Ethiopian national epic tells the story. And I agree that it seems an outrageous, impossible, and preposterous story in every possible way. But my curiosity was piqued, and I began to dig deeper. This is the sacred language of Ethiopia, which is called Ge'ez, a very ancient language, very closely related to Hebrew, as a matter of fact. There's a sense of an Old Testament community frozen in time in Ethiopia. And what I found is that every church in Ethiopia has a relic, a symbolic object
representing the Ark of the Covenant. Either it is a flat object representing the tablets of stone that they call the tabots, which are carried on that just represents the tablets of stone, the most important part of the Ark, or in some cases it's a box as an axle. And all of these objects gain their sanctity by reference to the original Ark of the Covenant, which they claim is kept in that sanctuary chapel in Axum. And indeed they're so important, these replicas, that if they are removed from a church, the church is instantly deconsecrated. So when they're carried out in procession, the church itself becomes a lay building, a secular building. And you see all these amazing dances that the Ethiopian priests are performing, which are very reminiscent of the dancing of David before the ark. The musical instruments that are played are identical. There they are dancing in front of the stele at Axum. I'm just comparing them with the accounts of the dancing around the ark in the Bible. There's an Ethiopian painting of the scene. And interestingly, the musical instrument that the priests are holding in their hands is called a sistrum. And there's an Ethiopian sistrum today, and they're a sistra from the tomb of Tutankhamun in ancient Egypt. So we're dealing with a very ancient musical instrument here that is still used in ritual in Ethiopia today. And Ethiopia has a population of indigenous Jews. Or rather, I should say had, because almost all of the Falashas, a few have re-migrated, but almost all of the Falashas were taken from Ethiopia to Israel in Operation Solomon in 1991. And this was because the Mengistu dictatorship in Ethiopia had fallen at the hands of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And there was a fear in Israel that the Ethiopian Jews... You're finding something intriguing there? Or?
I am. That's my best friend's father.
Are you serious?
Who brought all the Ethiopians.
Okay.
I just can't believe this happening.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, it was an epic moment, and Santa was there to photograph it and saw the incredibly emotional scenes as the Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, were brought in. Tell about it, Santa.
It was quite an incredible time, because in Addis, this was during the downfall of Mengistu, whilst the Tigrayans came into the city to take over the country, the Israelites brought in these enormous planes. They were literally like, cattle planes, no seats, nothing. And they came in and brought buses and buses and brought all those people from Gondar into Addis. And they were in front of the Israeli embassy. And what I didn't like about it, I wish I had an image of it, is that they stamped. It just reminded me of the time during World War II, what the Nazis did to the Jews, where they stamped them. Yeah, you've seen pictures, images of them being stamped. And all these Ethiopian Jewish people had stamped. They were stamped before they were herded onto buses to take them away. And it was a nightmare. They all wanted to leave.
You had a woman hand you her baby.
And there were women having babies. They locked the gates of the embassy. And they were passing babies over, and I was, close. And they handed me this newly born baby just outside the gate for the baby to go.
It was like the last hours of Vietnam.
It was a very emotional,
terribly emotional scene.
And chaotic scene. But they did take all of them.
They took them all.
They took them all.
They took them all, and it was an incredible movement of people. And they were. Ethiopia was collapsing, and they feared into chaos. In fact, the Tigray People's Liberation Front proved to be a responsible force, and there were no massacres. Yeah. But anyway, the Falashas. And by the way, the Falashas don't like to be called Falashas. They call themselves Beta Israel, which means House of Israel. The Falashas they see as an insulting term, but it is a term that's generally used for them. Santa and I traveled a lot amongst Beta Israel communities in Ethiopia, researching the story of the Ark of the Covenant before the Exodus. They lived a very humble, simple life. I don't think the Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Nagast, is chapter and verse true. I think it stands for the truth, and I think there are historical events behind it, and my quest became to establish a real historical route by which the Ark of the Covenant
could have got from here to here. And there's something missing from this map, and that is the Nile River, which connects Ethiopia to a point very close to Israel. It's like a road through the desert. And suddenly the distance doesn't seem so great. You know, the Nile has two streams, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. The Blue Nile rises in Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and it's actually responsible for most of the Nile's flow. And this is where, if you get back, I spent a lot of time with a professor at the Hebrew University called Menahem Haran, who's a great expert on this particular period. And Menahem Haran is convinced that the Ark of the Covenant was not in the temple when the Babylonians sacked the temple. He's convinced that the Ark of the Covenant came out of the temple long before that date. And he associates it with the reign of Manasseh, who was a king who reigned from 687 to 642 BC, and who was an idolater. He's actually reviled in the Bible for abandoning the traditional Judaic faith, and he reintroduced pagan religious worship to Israel. And he installed what is called an Asherah, a pagan idol, which is sometimes represented as a tree and sometimes as a female figure. He installed this pagan idol in the Holy of Holies in the temple. And Menahem Haran's view is that there's no way that those who were loyal to the traditional religion of Israel could have allowed the Ark of the Covenant to be contaminated by proximity to this Asherah. That it would have had to have been taken out of the temple during the reign of Manasseh. That they would never have allowed it to stay there. And then, after Manasseh, we hear about Josiah cleansing the land of idols. And it said unto the Levites that taught all Israel which were holy unto the Lord. This is really interesting. Josiah is telling the Levites to put the ark back in the temple. And this is still before the sacking of the temple. Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, did build. It shall not be a burden upon your shoulders. In other words, there's a very strong suggestion that Josiah is aware that the ark is not in the temple and that the Levites need to bring it back. Well, I don't think they brought it back, because this is where the mystery gets really interesting. Up here at Aswan, in Upper Egypt, in exactly the time between Manasseh and Josiah, a Jewish temple is built. And that is a weird thing to happen in the First Temple period. To have, there were a couple of later temples in the Second Temple period, but to have another temple in the First Temple period is a very odd thing to happen. And it's built at Aswan, on the island of Elephantina in Aswan, and very good historical records of this. They're written on potsherds called ostraka. There was some communication went back and forth between Jerusalem and this temple on the island of Elephantina. And indeed, there are excavations being conducted by the German Archaeological Institute on the island of Elephantina, and you can see the areas where the Jewish community lived on Elephantina. And although the temple has not survived, there's absolutely no doubt that there was a Jewish temple there, and that it was of the same dimensions as the Temple of Solomon and built according to the biblical blueprint. Why was the temple built in Jerusalem? As a house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Is it possible that this temple in Elephantina was built to house and safeguard the Ark during the reign of Manasseh? Now, the temple in Elephantina survived from the 650s BC down to about 400 BC. But there was a problem. The patron deity of Elephantina is the god Khnum. And Khnum is a ram deity. And the Jewish community on the island of Elephantina were sacrificing rams. And this led to problems with the Egyptians. And eventually that Jewish community was driven out of Elephantina. And they disappear from history. There's no firm evidence that they were massacred. It seems most implausible that they would have gone north through a hostile Egypt. I believe they went south, and that they followed the Nile River system right up into the highlands of Ethiopia, and came indeed to Lake Tana, as the Falasha traditions maintain. And there's the amazing and majestic Blue Nile Falls, which give you some sense of the flow of the Nile out of Lake Tana. I have to tell you a sad story about the Blue Nile Falls. You can't see this today. No. The quest for power in Ethiopia has led the Ethiopian government to the most unwise decision to install a huge hydroelectric plant there. And they've diverted the Nile, and the Blue Nile foals no longer exist. Every now and then they'll switch them on again for some reason. But this incredible natural scene no longer exists. They were, I mean, amongst the great waterfall scenes of the world. Very, very sad. On Lake Tana you find reed boats, rather like the ancient Egyptian reed boats, and a general air of antiquity and mystery. Many Ethiopian churches with lots of monks, and it was amongst those monks that I heard an interesting story, because I was asking around about the Ark of the Covenant. I wanted to follow up that Beta Israel story, the Elisha story, that the Ark had been brought to Lake Tana. And a monk told me, yeah, actually it's still here. It's on the island of Tana Kirkos. And so this is, again, these amazing churches around Lake Tana. Incredible art. And so Santha and I hired a boat, and we went off to Tana Kirkos, this is Tana Kirkos. Rather interesting island. Nobody ever goes there. And on Tana Kirkos we found a community of Christian monks and ancient relics. We later brought Professor Richard Pankhurst, who's the leading Western historian of Ethiopia there, and he confirmed that these were of the Aksumite period, dating back before the time of Christ. And the monks there tell the story. They say the Ark, they said, no, the Ark isn't with us. Now that monk misinformed you. The Ark is in Aksum, but the Ark of the Covenant was here for 800 years. We were Jews then. The Ark was taken to Aksum by force in the time of King Izana. King Izana was the Ethiopian king who converted to Christianity. And his headquarters was Aksum. And so this is the suggestion that the Ark was brought to Lake Tana, as the Falashas say, that it rested on the island of Tana Kirkos for 800 years, and that in the historical period, in the time of King Izana, it was taken by force to Aksum, and became the center of this curiously Old Testament form of Christianity that is practiced in Ethiopia. And again, these processions, the carrying out of the replica of the Ark, the whole scene. And this I was particularly struck by. On a fallen stela, this device, which nobody can explain, but which looks exactly like one of those arks from the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt. So, to cut a long story short, I don't think the Ark is in a warehouse in America, as the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie told us. I think it's in Ethiopia, or I think at least there's a good case for it being in Ethiopia. There's nowhere else in the world that has a living tradition of veneration of the Ark of the Covenant. There are some suggestions in Judaic traditions that the Ark was buried under the Temple Mount. It was buried on Mount Nebo in Jordan, but there's nowhere else in the world that has an entire religious system based around the veneration of it. So I think Ethiopia has a strong circumstantial case. No, I was never allowed into the temple to see the Ark of the Covenant, and I don't know of anybody who ever has been allowed in to see it. But I think the evidence adds up. Now, so, since we're on the subject of Steven Spielberg, I can't resist the Holy Grail, which was the next quest of Indiana Jones. I found some very interesting connections between the Grail and the Ark, which I described in my book, The Sign and the Seal. The two earliest references to the Holy Grail are in Chrétien de Troyes, excuse my French, in 1182, and in Wolfram von Essenbach, 1195 to 1200. We all think of the Grail as a cup, and Chrétien did describe it as a golden cup. But Wolfram von Essenbach described the Grail as a stone. A cup is a golden vessel. If you take a golden vessel and place a stone in it, what do you have? You have the Ark of the Covenant, which is a golden vessel with the stone tablets inside it. And Parzival, like Hiram, is the son of a widow. And to cut a long story short, my research suggests that the medieval quest for the Holy Grail was a coded reference to a real quest for the Ark of the Covenant, and that it was intimately connected with the Knights Templar, who themselves were the progenitors of Freemasonry. The Grail tradition begins in 1182, Jerusalem, where the Templars had their headquarters on the Temple Mount, was recaptured by Saladin in 1187, and Wolfram wrote his quest between 1195 and 1200. There is a artist's impression of the Temple of Solomon there on the Temple Mount back in Solomonic times. And here is Google Earth looking down on the Temple Mount today. And on the Temple Mount we see two Islamic structures. The Dome of the Rock, that's the Mosque of Omar. It's called the Dome of the Rock for reasons I'll come to in a moment. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is here. This whole area was the Temple of Solomon, but history has passed by. There was the later Second Temple was built there, sacked by the Romans, and now, since about the 600s or 700s AD, it's been an Islamic shrine.
Holy place to all three of the monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism and Islam.
Again, the model of the Temple of Solomon, and there the Dome of the Rock.
And it's called the Dome of the Rock
because of this rock which stands beneath the dome. And that was the floor
of the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Solomon. In other words, that's where the Ark of the Covenant stood when it was in the Holy of Holies.
And beneath it is the Well of Souls,
referred to in the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie.
And here's some interesting things. There's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's the Dome of the Rock.
The Templars took over the Temple Mount. That's why they're called the Templars, because they had the Temple Mount. It was their headquarters from 1118 until 1187. There were just 9 knights who first of all turned up in the Holy Land. At that time it was in Western hands. And they were given the Temple Mount as their sole prerogative. They would control it, they would run it. They were supposed to be defending pilgrims on the road between the coast and Jerusalem. They didn't do any of that. What they did was engage in an early form of archaeology. There are very well-established records of the Templars digging in the Temple Mount and tunneling. And in fact, some of the Templar tunnels were found in the 19th century.
And the Templars used the Al-Aqsa Mosque as their palace. And they created this facade
on the front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There is the north porch
of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, made by the Templars.
And there is the north porch of Chartres Cathedral
in France. Very similar architecture. And there's a really interesting little story told here in the north porch of Chartres Cathedral.
Well, we find Melchizedek
holding the Grail. We find the Queen of Sheba, and at her feet is a definitely African figure.
This says to me an association between the Queen of Sheba and Africa, which is exactly what the Ethiopians claim.
And lo and behold, there's an image of the Ark of the Covenant, which is being moved somewhere. It actually says, I can't speak Latin, but I had it translated for me, Hic amicitur Arca Cederis. Here is hidden the Ark of the Covenant. And it's being moved towards the figure of the Queen of Sheba. So I couldn't help wondering if there was a suggestion that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken to the land of the Queen of Sheba, Ethiopia. And then we come across this character. His name is Lalibela. He's an Ethiopian king, and he is exiled from the Ethiopian court, and the place he chooses for exile is Jerusalem. And he's there from 1160 to 1185, the height of Templar power. And he had his own mini court in Jerusalem. It is inconceivable that his path would not have crossed with the path of the Templars. He certainly would have known that. And he returned to Ethiopia with a mysterious supporting force, overthrew his rival, and became the king of Ethiopia. And the churches for which he's famous are said in Ethiopian legends to have been built by angels. So I couldn't help wondering, could these angels have been Knights Templar with their advanced skills as masons? And I have to confess, after seeing Ajanta today, I can't help wondering if some Indian craftsmen were involved as well, because Lalibela is astonishingly like Ajanta in many, many ways. Here is the whole Lalibela complex, which is a series of rock-hewn churches, 11 churches in all, with a river Jordan running through the middle of them. And that's the Church of St. George's, carved out of solid rock, seen from above. And again, a view of St. George's Church. So you understand that this was a single mass of rock, which was carved down, and this whole church was created and hollowed out inside. It's a place of living worship today. That's how it looks at the top, in the surrounding countryside. There are many of these churches that are cut into caves, exactly like we see at Ajanta. And amongst them is this church, the Church of St. Mary in Lalibela. Really interesting little church. Up on the ceiling of the church are lots of fascinating designs, including the swastika. The swastika is found all over St. Mary's Church. The swastika was a device of great significance to the Freemasons, found, for example, at Garway Temple Church in Hertfordshire in England. It's found all over the Church of St. Mary in Lalibela. And a Templar cross is found on the ceiling of the Church of St. Mary, surrounded by a Star of David. But what really seals it for me, a Templar connection with Lalibela, is the painting of the Al-Aqsa Mosque that appears on the walls of St. Mary's Church in Lalibela. Because in that painting of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, we see that the domes are surmounted by Christian crosses. And there was only one time when those domes were surmounted by Christian crosses, and that was when the Templars used the Al-Aqsa Mosque as their palace. So I'm suggesting very strongly that the Templars made a quest to Ethiopia and were in some way or another involved with Lalibela. And behind this, on this column, behind this cloth covering, is said to be a most secret inscription. But with sufficient amount of Ethiopian birr changing hands, we managed to persuade the monk to tell us what the inscription said. And he said, Sator Repo Opera Tenet. I have no idea what that meant. So that's what it says. Well, Sator Arepo Opera Tenet is the Templar magic square. You can read it in all directions, as you can see. It's older than the Templars, but they adopted it and they used it all over their architecture and their sacred buildings. So it's intriguing that that particular device is found inside St. Mary's Church in Lalibela. And Templar crosses are all over Aksum as well as Lalibela, and Templar symbolism is found all over those areas. And I'll just close with my, I hope, distant relative, James Bruce of Kinnaird. My middle name is Bruce. My mother's family were Bruces. And James Bruce was a great Scottish explorer who travelled to Ethiopia in the 18th century, between 1770 and 1771. He was very tall, apparently about 6'9", which was very tall for a man of the 17th, 18th century. And he was described by the acid tongue of Samuel Johnson as the tallest man I ever saw free of charge. And Samuel Johnson made such fun of James Bruce and refused to believe anything that James Bruce said. For example, when James Bruce said that he saw Ethiopians carving a steak off the back of a living cow and eating the steak raw and healing the wound with mud, Johnson scoffed at James Bruce. But actually Ethiopians still do that to this day, and I've seen it done myself. When he said that the Ethiopians have a musical instrument identical to the biblical lyre, Samuel Johnson said, since Mr. Bruce left Ethiopia, there is one less lyre in Ethiopia. But he was a heroic fellow, and it was a huge adventure to get up into the highlands of Ethiopia in that time. And he based himself here at the court of Philistines in these amazing churches in Gondar. Sorry, not churches, castles in Gondar. He learnt not only Amharic, the Ethiopian national language, but also Ge'ez, the Ethiopian sacred language. And what did Bruce bring back from Ethiopia if not the Book of Enoch? We would not have the Book of Enoch if it were not for James Bruce. The Book of Enoch had been lost for 1,000 years, but it survived in translation in Ge'ez in Ethiopia. And Bruce acquired it there and brought it back, and all our modern English translations of the Book of Enoch are based on the Book of Enoch that James Bruce discovered and found in Ethiopia. In other words, he had mystical interests. And I began to home in on this and really studied what he wrote about his journeys. And it became clear to me that he was really interested in the Ark of the Covenant. He said he went there to look for the source of the Nile, but what it was all about was the Ark of the Covenant. That's what he was looking for. And I developed the theory that James Bruce must have been a Freemason, but I couldn't prove it. So Santha and I went to the place where he was buried in Larbert Churchyard. And we found his grave in a terrible state of disrepair, but we found this obelisk then at the time lying on its side in the car park. And on it was inscribed these words about James Bruce. Nice things said about James Bruce here. And it was clear that somebody was restoring the obelisk and restoring the grave. So we asked the keeper of the church, who's doing that? And he said, it's the Earl of Elgin. He is the head of the Bruce family in Scotland. And I thought, well, okay, he's a distant relative of mine. I'll give him a call. So I got the number of his estate at Elgin, picked up the phone, called him, and amazingly he answered the phone. And I said, look, I hear that you're a great expert on James Bruce. Would you see me? I'm a journalist. I'm doing a research about James Bruce. And he said, I'll give you half an hour. So we went over there, and he greeted us at the door, and close to 6 hours later, we left. And we had an amazing afternoon with the Earl of Elgin, who still survives, and he's still the head of Freemasonry in Scotland. About halfway through the encounter, I said, look, I've got this theory, but I can't prove it that James Bruce was a Freemason. Was he a Freemason? He said, my dear boy, of course he was a Freemason. and he belonged to Kilwinning Lodge number 2 in Edinburgh. And he gave me the whole story. So kind of made sense that James Bruce was one of the latter people on that quest. Just to end on a more somber note, here is the Wailing Wall today. This is, of course, a very sacred place to Jews all over the world. It is the remnant of the Second Temple, and it is what is left from those ancient times. And amazing ceremonies and rituals are performed in front of it. But there is, I touched on this the other day. I mean, the three monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they're full of rational, lovely, good people who wouldn't harm a fly, but there are also very fundamentalist elements within all three of the monotheistic faiths. And in Israel, the fundamentalist element is represented by the Temple Mount faithful. Santha and I were present in 1992 when the Temple Mount massacre occurred, which was sparked off by a march of the Temple Mount faithful. Their objective is to build the third temple. They want to sweep the Islamic monuments out of the Temple Mount and replace them with the third temple. And they freely admit that in order to build the third temple, they need the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is fundamental to their project. And not only they, but also Shia Islam needs the Ark of the Covenant. Everybody's heard of the Mahdi army in Iraq. It's named after this figure, the hidden imam, who was said to have been hidden away by God after a battle in the 800s or 900s AD, and who would come back into the world today. Shias believe he's in the world now, and they believe that he's going to recover the Ark of the Covenant. The Mahdi will bring forth the Ark. The reason he's called Hazrat Mahdi is that he shows the way to a hidden thing. He will bring forth the Ark of the Covenant. The whole apocalyptic scenario within Shia Islam is based upon the Ark of the Covenant. And it's true of Christians too. Because in the book of Revelations, the Ark is one of the signs, the return of the Ark is one of the signs of the Day of Judgment at the end of the world. So from the perspective of fundamentalist Christianity, the reappearance of the Ark of the Covenant is a necessary sign of this coming apocalypse. Which is why I feel that maybe that ancient story is right, and that God did want the Ark of the Covenant to be in Ethiopia, and maybe that's just the very best place for it to stay, hidden away in those remote mountains and valleys, kept aside from all of the conflict and hostility that focuses around Israel today. As a matter of fact, we talked to the Israeli ambassador in Ethiopia back in the 90s, and we said to him, we told him about our interest in the Ark, and we said to him, come on, you guys have got Mossad, you can take the Ark if you want to. And he said, look, I can only speak for myself, but the last thing I want is the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem right now. He said, I'd much prefer it stayed here if it's here. It's just going to cause a hornet's nest of problems. And I thought that was very wise and very true. So, I don't know. I can't prove it, but I think it's there. Thank you. Time for dinner. The next Q&A, which I promised I won't duck out of, will be done on the bus between Amritsar and Dharamsala. Oh, and one thing more. I am, if you're up to it, and if anybody wants to hear it, willing to do another 30 or 40-minute talk tomorrow when we're back in Delhi. Not a long, epic one like this, but about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, which will be, which we can do in the hotel in Delhi at around 8 o'clock. Around 8 o'clock. All of these structures were totally natural and had nothing to do with human workmanship at all, was hasty. I felt it merited more work on his part than simply 2 dives of an incompetent diver who's mainly fighting for his life rather than studying the monuments. And that raises questions in my mind over Schock's judgment on the Bosnian pyramids as well, which he has also dismissed as natural. But I will make up my own mind on the Bosnian pyramids when I visit them in July this year, and until then I'm going to withhold judgment. These 2 gigantic pillars lie side by side against a huge rocky outcrop. I don't doubt that the rocky outcrop is natural, but I believe these 2 pillars have been put into place by human workmanship. The geological view is that they somehow fell neatly into place without breaking from some cliff above, and the fact that there is no cliff immediately above that point doesn't disturb those geologists. This is how the pillars look against the rocky outcrop in context. And if we now swim around here, we come to the terraces of Yonaguni, which are certainly the most striking feature of the monument, with these very clear rock-cut terraces in the side of the monument. And the argument that they are natural is based on the following assumption, namely that this is a sedimentary rock, and that as it was laid down over the course of geological time, softer and harder layers were laid in place. And then as sea level rose, beating against the rock, flat patio in front of it, and again along this pathway there are gutters on either side.
Now I want to take you further north now to Okinawa
And what are called the Kerama group of islands, and specifically Akajima, 40 kilometers west of Okinawa, where we found these structures underwater. They were actually found by a local Japanese diver, and he drew our attention to them. And there's two distinct aspects. There are small, what turn out to be river stones, which appear to be cemented to the seabed in semicircular formations. And then there is a huge rock-cut series of stone circles, which are actually, they're not built, they're carved down into the bedrock on a very substantial scale. And that gives you the scale. That's me holding the video camera there. And of course all of these photographs are taken by Santa, I need to emphasize. I don't give enough credit to my amazing wife, who risks her life. Because, you know, diving and photographing on these structures requires a whole mixture of different skills, and sometimes the dives are incredibly difficult. Yeah.
Can I just ask you to mention the Kerala?
Yeah.
Where the German geologists did off-camera say.
Yeah.
That's
Wolf Richmond, yeah, absolutely. So what we're looking at here is a central upright with a series of surrounding megaliths, all of which are carved out of the solid bedrock at the bottom of the sea. And you can see that the outer megaliths form a kind of spiral around the central upright. And the way that the outer curve of the central upright matches the inner curve of the surrounding uprights is particularly impressive to me. I don't think more map. And a bay here, exactly as we see on this 1424 map, there's a case for saying that this 1424 map of Japan is showing Japan as it looked during the last ice age, and like many other mysterious maps from that period, is copied from older source maps, now lost. And that is a preface to taking a look at the underwater monuments of Yonaguni, which are Yonaguni is the most southwestern of all the Japanese islands. It lies within sight on a clear day of Taiwan. And Santa and I were first introduced to the possibility that there were structures underwater there back in 1996. 1996, 1997, we learned to dive in order to go diving there. And then subsequently, we put in at least 200 dives in and around Yonaguni, which I think qualifies us as the most immersed and most experienced Western divers who dived in Japan. There are one or two Japanese divers, notably Professor Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus, who have dived on that structure more than we have. He and his students have done hundreds and hundreds of dives. But Kimura and I both agree that what we're looking at is a gigantic man-made underwater complex, where I have to disagree with my good friend Robert Schock, the professor of geology at Boston University, who I took to Yonaguni in 1997. Schock was not capable of diving at that point, and he had to be held underwater by two Japanese divers. He found himself in a terrifying situation in the current, very severe current which flows past the monuments, rather stronger than a river in its force. And I felt that his judgment that Ethiopia and the Ark of the Covenant.
But you may wonder why I'm showing you a map of Japan. The reason is I thought that I would just spend 10 minutes showing those who haven't seen them the underwater ruins of Japan, where Santa and I put in more than 200 dives. And I just want to preface that with this rather curious map from 1424, which shows Japan. This is a theme I didn't go into in my talk the other night because there wasn't time to cover all the ground, but there are many ancient maps which are copied from older source maps which appear to show the world as it looked during the last ice age. And this 1424 Pisagano chart, which belongs to the Portolan tradition of map making, shows the three main islands of Japan, which are Honshu, Kyushu and Shikoku, shows the three main islands of Japan as one island. And actually, that was the case during the Ice Age and down to about 12,000 years ago. And this is how Japan looked, the main islands of Japan looked during the Ice Age, with a deep, one single landmass, not three islands as they are today, and with a deep inlet here, exactly as we see on this 1420. It selectively removed the softer layers and left the harder layers in place, giving this stepped formation. And it's not a totally ridiculous argument, but once you get to know the monument well, as we have done, and I think it's a monument that deserves hundreds of dives rather than 2 dives, once you get to know it well, you realize that there's problems with that explanation. Because where you would expect to see all of that rubble that was removed from here, supposedly by the sea, in order to create this stepped effect, well, you'd expect to see it down below those terraces, down here, but what you see instead is a perfectly clear, straight pathway. And on that pathway, all the rubble has been cleared to one side, leaving the pathway intact, and there are indeed gutters running along the side of the pathway. So to me, that speaks of human workmanship rather than the work of nature. And then we have this extraordinary face underwater further up the coast, about half a mile further up the coast, where you have 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth looking due south. And I'm in there for scale. It's a gigantic structure. There are in fact pupils in the eyes. And if you look here, you can see that there are the remnants of a headdress on the side of this underwater face. And if nature did make it, it was quite amazing that nature separated off the head from the rest of the rocky outcrop in order to make it. And as we pull back, we can see the whole thing in context and see that there's a huge